Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Michelle D'Amico, and I'm the Director of Continuing Education and Public Programs at the NYU SPS Center for Global Affairs. I'm also really delighted to support the programming for the NYU SPS Energy, Climate Justice, and Sustainability Lab here at the school. Today, we have an exciting conversation set up for you. It is the second day of our virtual food forum that we are offering in partnership with the NYU Office of Sustainability, the New York City Mayor's Office of Food Policy, and the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance. Today's conversation will be moderated by my fantastic colleague, Amy Myers-Jaffe, who is a research professor and director of the Energy, Climate Justice, and Sustainability Lab. And we will be talking about the food system and its impact on the planet. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Amy.
So I'm going to introduce the panel. We have a great panel today on this subject. We have people who have been participating both in the thought leadership area, but also in the world of action, as we call it, so that people who are out there implementing policy and implementing change. And I also am excited because one of them is a former colleague, so great to be doing something together again. And so I've asked him, Colin Murphy, to start. But let me first introduce the whole panel. So Colin Murphy is Deputy Director of the UC Davis Policy Institute for Energy, Environment, and the Economy, and he co-directs the ITS Davis Low Carbon Fuel Policy Research Initiatives. Those two programs are very instrumental in advisory to California on its sustainable fuel policies, and they do a lot of work that bridges the gap between sort of cutting-edge academic research and data analysis and the day-to-day sort of nitty-gritty of policy making. So Colin's also served as a science policy fellow with the California Council on Science and Technology, and he also worked as an advocate for the NGO Next Gen Policy Center. So with that, that's Colin. Now let me tell you about our other panelists, equally exciting. Eve-Turow is founder and executive director at the Food for Climate League. That's a woman-led nonprofit working to make climate-smart eating the norm for all of us. And she is well-known thought leader on youth food culture, well-being, and sustainability. She's got a consultancy, ETP Insights, and she got some books out. So we're really excited to have her here with us. And then we're equally delighted to have Regina Harmon, who has been executive director of the Food Recovery Network since 2015. They unite 6,000 plus college students, food suppliers, farmers, and local businesses from across the food supply chain and work to organize to have that donated to local nonprofits that feed people experiencing hunger. So she's really there in the trenches. So we're very excited to get the program started. I've asked Colin to just give us sort of a global overview of, where agriculture sits in the greenhouse gas emissions challenge. And then we'll go to having an opening statement from each of our speakers. Colin, take it away.
All right, let's see. Let me get the slides up. So thank you, Amy. I really appreciate the invitation. We certainly miss you back in California, and always happy to have a chance to speak with you again. Can you, let's get into, can we see the slides?
Yeah, we're seeing the slides well.
Perfect, okay. So yeah, happy to be here. As Amy said, I work largely on sort of climate change by alternative fuel policy, and that leads me to the intersection of climate policy and agriculture quite a bit, because there's a lot of opportunities to sort of leverage the value of agriculture to reduce emissions, but it doesn't always work out as nicely or easily as we'd hope. So at a very high level, agriculture, if you look at estimates of its contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions, You'll actually find a rather variable number. It's surprisingly hard to assess. Some of this is we just don't have great data on that. Some of it's also there's a lot of different system boundaries that you can draw to figure out exactly what's considered part of agriculture versus part of other things. But typically you'll find numbers between about 10 and 20% of total global greenhouse gases come from agriculture in one way or another. Livestock emissions tend to be the largest part of that because there's a lot of methane associated with livestock, though, to some extent, this depends on how you weight methane in comparison to carbon dioxide. And it's important to recognize that anywhere within agriculture, a significant amount of the total food that we produce ends up being wasted, though it's usually not wasted after it gets onto a grocery store shelf. It's usually either unable to be harvested or brought to a market in time. So a lot of that waste happens before it gets into the consumer's world. So there are a number of ways to reduce agricultural emissions, and we can talk about some of these in more depth later if it's of interest. Obviously, reducing waste, you can reduce the amount of fertilizer you use. You can change the composition of fertilizer to reduce the amount of nitrous oxide that volatilizes after you apply it to fields. You can, trying to reduce the degree to which agriculture contributes to deforestation or converting natural land is a way to significantly change emissions. You can change the way that solid carbon from plant matter, organic carbon accumulates in the soil by either reducing how much you till it, sort of disturb it and add air and support the microbes in there, or you can add organic carbon in one way or another, things like compost or agricultural residues or biochar or manure. Though with any of the soil carbon activities, things to increase soil carbon, you have to be careful. You can put carbon in the soil through good management, but if you change your management later and start tilling and sort of revert back to traditional high intensity industrial agriculture, a lot of that carbon can be lost, and that makes designing sort of policies very tricky, and we can talk about that later. Generally speaking, reducing animal product consumption, especially beef, can reduce the footprint of agriculture and food provision. Generally, there are also ways to sort of have lower impact methods of producing that. Rice tends to be a big source of methane because when you flood rice paddies, which is done to reduce the amount of pesticides needed, you get sort of anoxic conditions under the water, which reduces methane. And in a lot of parts of the world, after the edible part of a crop is harvested, the residue is often burned in order to sort of deal with the waste that would otherwise be just kind of piled or disposed of, and to return some of the nutrients. But that burning releases all the carbon, also releases a lot of black carbon, methane, and other pollutants. Now, one of the real challenges with all of these methods, we have a lot of research on all of them, and we are confident that these generally push things in the right direction, that they can be helpful in one way or another. But quantifying the actual benefit on a given farmer's field, that's remarkably difficult. And a lot of the models we have are still struggling to do that with a lot of precision. And as governments try to develop policies to incentivize growers to use these lower impact methods, we are running into a situation where a lot of the models that we have that would try to quantify this stuff, we don't have as much confidence in them as we'd like if we're going to start putting very significant sums of money, usually if it's coming from government tax money. So that's one of the challenges and one of the needs for ongoing research in this space. So like Amy said, I tend to work in the biofuel space quite a bit, looking at policies to figure out what the sort of most appropriate use of biofuels is. And one thing that comes up a lot is there sort of a food versus fuel competition? Are we taking food out of people's mouths in order to put it into vehicles or into other energy sources? So one thing to be aware of is, first, by far, the most common biofuel that is used globally is wood, for firewood, for cooking and home heating in a lot of emerging economies. So this is a graph from the IEA. Transportation, which is sort of the biofuels we think of, the ethanol and biodiesel, that's that little yellow line down near the bottom. Most of the biomass that goes into the energy system goes into home heating, cooking, things like that. So obviously there's significant benefits that can be gained by reducing that use, as well as major air quality benefits in a number of emerging economies. But when we want to talk a little more about the things that we typically think about of as biofuels, in the US, ethanol by volume is by far the biggest biofuel we make. We produce about 15 billion gallons a year of it in the US. It's mostly from corn. Though when we make corn ethanol, what happens is you take the corn, you send it to the ethanol producer, all of the starch gets taken out and the starch gets broken down into sugar, and that's fermented to make ethanol. But what's left behind is the protein, the fiber, and all of the yeast they use for fermentation gets put in this solid byproduct that's then sold for animal feed. So there's this perception that when you use ethanol, all that corn is sort of taken out of the food market entirely. Well, what actually happens is the starch part of it is taken out of the food market, but you're left with a higher protein animal feed. And so because you have this sort of complex trade-off, the food versus fuel impact of corn has been perhaps not as great as we might have otherwise thought at first, because a lot of that corn would have been used for animal feed anyway. So it sort of gets brought back into the system. It's not a complete sort of full equivalency, but the amount of sort of food value lost due to ethanol is perhaps not as high as we might think. The amount of ethanol that the US produces is largely set by the federal renewable fuel standard. It has stayed relatively stable over the last 15 years. This is not an industry where it looks likely there's going to be a lot of growth in ethanol. The growth is actually coming in biomass-based diesel. So there's really two kinds of biomass-based diesel: biodiesel and renewable diesel. These are chemically different things. They function slightly differently in vehicles. We can get into distinction there, but both of them are made from fats, oils, and greases. So this can be things like used cooking oil, tallow from meat processing. When you make ethanol, you can often make sort of an inedible corn oil byproduct. And then also you can make these things out of soybean oil or any other vegetable oil. In the US over the last 5 years, renewable diesel has grown incredibly quickly. So this graph shows the sort of total growth in feedstock consumption, the total fats, oils, and greases being used in this space. And you can see there's been really rapid growth, especially in the last 5 years. That has mostly been on the renewable diesel side. Biodiesel has stayed kind of relatively stable at about 1.5 billion gallons a year in the US. The process to make renewable diesel can also be used to make aviation fuels. It's a slightly chemically different process, but a lot of the producers actually end up making both of them simultaneously. So one of the interesting things we're seeing is in the US, and the same is true in Europe, we have already kind of tapped all the sources of used cooking oil and tallow, all the wastes and residues that may have been used but didn't have a lot of high value uses. So we're seeing crop oils grow and the amount of consumption of crop oils increase over time. The US is now also importing very significant volumes of used cooking oil and tallow from places from Asia and Australia, especially China. And that's a really interesting dynamic because on one hand, we're utilizing a waste product, and while some of it was probably used in the countries that created it, perhaps not all of it, but it leads to this question of, is it okay for the US to take waste products in order to make a very low carbon fuel domestically and deny other countries the ability to do that? Beyond that, even with the wastes, historically, most of it would be used, or a lot of it would be used for things like animal feed or making candles or soaps. And so even if you're using a waste and residue to make fuels, whoever was making the animal feed, candles, and soaps, they still want to be in business. They have to go and buy a vegetable oil. So you have this phenomenon called indirect land use change, where when you take the really preferable feedstocks for making fuels, everybody else who was using them in the past, they start having to buy vegetable oil. And so it turns into this very complex system that makes it difficult for us to actually accurately assess the greenhouse gas implications of biofuels. I spend a lot of time in my day job thinking about that. So generally speaking, even though we've seen this really rapid growth in the fat, oil, and grease space, and all this volume is ultimately resulting in more vegetable oil being produced to sort of fill the voids it creates in the global oil market, prices have remained relatively stable. We have not seen a huge increase in prices for vegetable oil. It has gone up and it's gone down during the period that this has happened. So we don't feel like this is causing a really big sort of food versus fuel problem right now, but we are very concerned about those indirect land use change problems and the possibility that biofuel policies might be spurring more deforestation globally. And so, yeah, again, there's a lot of work going on, and I'm happy to talk about it, but that is a very sort of deep rabbit hole to dive down, and fascinating and challenging in a lot of ways. The last thing I want to talk about is an area of bioenergy production in the food space that has gotten extremely controversial in ways that we wouldn't really think about it from the sort of high level view, and that is renewable natural gas, especially renewable natural gas made from animal manure. So when organic matter decomposes, normally, microbes digest whatever solid carbon is in that organic matter and release primarily carbon dioxide. But if that decomposition happens in a place where there's no oxygen, they use other pathways and they emit what we call biogas that is largely composed of methane. And methane is the main component of natural gas, right? It carries energy and it can be used as an industrial chemical. So you can make biogas from a number of things. Like landfills generate methane naturally. That's why most landfills have to have pipes that collect it. And historically, they would just flare it to make sure you didn't have explosive gas building up under the landfill. Historically, landfills occasionally did explode because of the accumulation of this biogas. Now we tend to capture it and either flare it for safety, or we can clean it up and purify it and put it into the natural gas pipeline to displace fossil gas. In cases like sort of organic waste being put in landfills or livestock manure, historically, some of this stuff, as it decomposed naturally, it would have emitted some methane as well as carbon dioxide. And so in some ways, if you capture this and make renewable natural gas, not only are you producing a valuable energy product, but you're preventing the fugitive release of this methane that would have happened under kind of natural conditions. And so these are called avoided methane credits, and they've been used in carbon offset programs, as well as in programs that look at the life cycle carbon intensity of fuels, where if somebody does a project to capture all the methane that was being generated by livestock manure, not only do they get this low carbon renewable gas as a result, but they also get a credit for stopping the methane that would have been released if it had been sort of put in the lagoon and left to decompose naturally, which is the sort of historical way that has been happened. This process, especially the way it's happening in California and the way it's been supported by California's low carbon fuel standard, has become incredibly controversial because there are a lot of environmental justice groups, many of whom represent communities that live near major dairies and livestock operations, that feel like giving additional money to concentrated animal feeding operations to big industrial dairies supports their business practice, the concentration of animals in a small place. And if you've ever driven by a dairy with your windows open, you can smell it. It's not pleasant, and there are health impacts if someone lives near that on a regular basis. And while the digesters are reasonably good at reducing methane, they don't eliminate all of it, but they can at least significantly reduce methane. They don't do nearly as much to help with the local pollutants. And so a lot of environmental justice groups are upset that you essentially now have dairies getting climate mitigation money to keep doing business in a way that has these local public health impacts that are damaging their community. So they have been deeply opposed to any programs that would support the use of digesters at dairies or livestock operations. And that has been, whenever we sort of bring up the LCFS in California, and this program's in a rulemaking right now, they're trying to amend it to improve its ability to function for the next decade. When this subject comes up, it kind of takes all the air out of the room and focuses the topic on that because, from a very analytic perspective, using manure to make energy seems like a slam dunk win. But for a lot of communities, they strongly disagree with it, and neither side has sort of a solution that seems like a good compromise position that people could move forward on. So certainly happy to discuss this in more depth when we get to Q&A. I will say that the way the low carbon fuel standard has treated this has supported a lot of dairies adding digesters around the country in order to produce renewable natural gas that can be injected in pipelines and shipped through the pipelines to California. From a climate standpoint, this is probably a good thing. We have good confidence that it's a good thing, but the local impacts are still there, and we don't have a great solution for those yet at this point. So there's a lot of depth and a lot of material here. I'm certainly happy to follow up with anybody offline. The slides are fine to circulate. There's a few of the papers that we've published on sort of biofuel policy here, and my contact information is on there. So that's it. Amy and Michelle, back to you.
Okay, great. So I'm going to ask Eve to go next. And Eve, if you could sort of bring it to a slightly different angle, which is looking at, sort of food culture and the policy space where we would exercise more consumer-driven section of the industry.
Absolutely. So I'm going to take a hard pivot, Colin, even though I'm super interested in what you were talking about. And it all does intersect. I think what's interesting today is we're all tackling the same issue from very different angles, but the work that we do is dependent upon one another. And so first, hi, I'm Eve-Turow Paul. It's a pleasure to be here today. My area of expertise is with millennial food culture, is actually how I got into this. I've written 2 books on global food culture, the rise of foodieism. And then in that process, really learned about the damaging impacts of food and agriculture and began to focus on how might we make climate smart, sustainable ways of eating the cultural norm. Food for Climate League is the organization that I founded and now run. And we use narrative and behavioral strategies in order to change the way people think and behave when it comes to sustainable food choices. The work that we do is both on direct to eater, so how do we change the hearts and minds of the everyday public, but a lot of our work is also about changing the hearts and minds of city leadership, of people who work in corporations and NGOs, the power holders within the food system. And I've been asked to outline what the problem is, what's getting in the way, and what do we need to solve it. And so I'm just going to talk through it. The problem as we see it at Food for Climate League is that climate smart food choices are not the norm. It is a niche area of food culture. And this is for a multitude of reasons. When I started this organization, we did an extensive landscape analysis of looking at, well, what is the common narrative of food and climate? What we found is that, number one, it's almost always framed in the negative. It's about what we're taking out of our food system, about what we're taking off of our plates. This goes against the basic 101s of food marketing. You don't sell somebody something by telling them what they're not eating. Who really wants to eat a meatless patty? Food is our fuel. Going back to fuel, we want to know what it is that we are ingesting. The other problem here is that the majority of the framing is targeting a white, wealthy Western audience. That is not the majority of the global population. That is not the majority of people who want to take action on the climate crisis. This is when you really look at the language and the framing that's used by corporations, NGOs, even cities, they're really have a blind spot to who is leading the change. The African-American community here in the United States is 3 times more likely to have a plant-based diet than white Americans. And yet the majority of branding and communications is, again, very targeted towards this very, very white audience. I call it kind of the Goop swell bottle type of persona, or kind of hippie granola. Those are kind of the 2 brand markets that people generally work towards. So at Food for Climate League, we're all about meeting people where they are. What does that mean? It means that we need to recognize the fact that we're also facing record high rates of stress, anxiety, loneliness, and depression. I've heard from many different food companies that, oh, young people today just don't care about sustainability. They don't care about the climate crisis. And we know this because our sustainable food products don't sell well, or our campaigns don't get the engagement that they need. I'm here to tell you, the vast majority of people are terrified of the climate crisis. And if you want to look up these statistics, you can go, the Yale program on climate communications is tracking this all the time. They just released some new data this week. It's super interesting to futz around on their website and look at this, but this is not political anymore. The vast majority of Americans are alarmed and concerned, but again, we're facing these record high rates of stress, loneliness, anxiety, and depression, and most people are just trying to make it through the day. What that means is that although people are paralyzed by this fear, they're not making their decisions based on sustainability. And in fact, our minds did not evolve to make decisions based on an amorphous kind of future threat. We're very focused on what we're going to be gaining right now. What is the experience that I'm having right now? And that's also true in business. It's about quarterly earnings. It's not about making sure that your business is still viable in 5 years, although it should be. That is a reframe that we really need to get to. So what's getting in the way of us solving this problem is human nature. It's capitalism, it's bias. And a lot of what we work on at Food for Climate League is the stories that we tell ourselves. And what we have found is that all too often eaters tell themselves, oh, the sustainable way of eating is too expensive, not tasty, not filling, not for me. From business leaders, we hear, we're not going to make money. People don't want this. Sustainability is not my job. What we have learned is that that internal narrative is step 1 in changing the food system. because without changing that narrative, you're not going to change people's behaviors. And that narrative can change through storytelling, through traditional storytelling. It could be change in environment. You are through choice architecture, the way that we arrange our environments, we're also telling stories through that. And we really believe that we need to ultimately change the way that people are thinking about two core topics, which Colin did bring up. One is plant-forward diets. How do we inspire people to diversify their diets and incorporate more plants? So we're just talking about changing the ratio of plants to animal proteins. And the other is, how do we change the narrative around food waste? How do we get people to see food as the valued ingredient that it is? A lot of this has to do with consumer education, but it also has to do with processing. And again, the mentality of, oh, I'll just throw this out. It's not a big deal. Well, it is a big deal. And you're throwing away your own earnings. So for us, we think about, how do we get people to eat more plant-forward diets? Put another way, diversify your plate. There are over 400,000 edible plant species on this planet. 75% of human calories come from 11 plants and 3 animals. That's what makes up 75% of our calories, and there's 400,000 edible plant species. From a culinary perspective, how boring is that? Think of all of the Instagrammable culinary opportunities that are just waiting for us if we can just diversify our diets and have some fun. And then the other is to stop wasting food, or put another way, stop wasting your money. Think of all the resources, the new things to discover. You can eat a full broccoli plant. You can be eating the leaves and the stems, and we're just ditching this stuff in order to break down, and as Colin just went through, causing a lot, wreaking havoc on the environment. So we are really all about, how do we reframe this so that people can discover a new norm? So we have new expectations of one another as individuals, but also within the industry. So if you want to learn more about Food for Climate League, I'll put my information in the chat as well. And from there, I'll hand it off to the next speaker.
Okay, well, that's a great lead into Regina, because that is precisely the area that she has worked long and hard on. So Regina, take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy and Eve and Colin. Thank you so much. Michelle, thank you for helping to organize all of us. Everyone listening, thank you for your precious time, a non-renewable resource. Really appreciate you here, and to all the future listeners. My name is Regina Harmon. I'm the Executive Director of Food Recovery Network. We are headquartered here in Washington, D.C., which is English translation, the land of the Piscataway Conoy tribe. They are a modern day tribe, meaning they are alive still. They inhabit a lot of Maryland. And so I wanted to give some space to say thank you to the Piscataway Conoy for continuing to be stewards of our land, our water, and our land, our water, our air. So Food Recovery Network, we are a national nonprofit. We started in 2011 at the University of Maryland. We were started by college students who saw a few things happening in their ecosystem at the University of Maryland. The first being they saw a lot of food being wasted on their college campus. They had work studies in the food court, and one of the co-founders was a student athlete, and so after practice would go running down the quad to get to one of the food locations, and would see firsthand, at 4:58 p.m. the food was perfectly fine to be purchased, but at 5:01 p.m. saw that food being thrown away. So they saw firsthand that there was a lot of food at their school being thrown away. And then just as younger people trying to figure out how did they want to be civically engaged in their communities, they tried out a lot of volunteering activities in the College Park area. So they did a lot of peanut butter and jelly sandwich making drives. They volunteered at soup kitchens, and saw firsthand, people in their neighborhoods who were suffering from food insecurity. And then light bulbs went off. Our school is throwing away all this really precious food that we know it's still perfectly fine to eat, and people in my neighborhood are hungry. So they devised a plan. Hey, can we, instead of throwing away all that food that's still in the kitchen, package that up and then donate it down the street to a church that we've been volunteering at? And the first response that they got from their dining provider, when they were able to get her attention, because she tried to have them. She didn't want to give them the time of day, but they were persistent. Finally had a meeting with her and pitched the idea, and she said, actually, that's a really good idea. We can do that. And then infused her food safety into that concept. That is how Food Recovery Network was born. And within just a few months, several thousand pounds of prepared food had been recovered and donated. From there, the students at Food Recovery Network literally began calling their friends at other schools. So for some of you who might not know this gesture, calling, they called their friends from across all over the United States and said, hey, we started this thing, we're recovering food, you should do it too. And the students at Berkeley, at Paloma, Brown University said, yeah, sure, that sounds great. And they put forward all the information that the students would need to do recoveries on their college campuses, literally a grassroots movement. And within the first year of Food Recovery Network becoming a national nonprofit in 2011, we had about 7 schools. Then that grew to 24. Let me flash forward to today, 2024. We have about 200 college campuses that have FRN chapters that are actively recovering food. And we have recovered almost 17 million pounds of food through the power of people, 1 carload of food at a time, who take the time to recover surplus prepared food from their college dining halls. Now, let me back up a little bit to further contextualize where Food Recovery Network sits. As we said, and there's been a lot of history, so many of us, went through the pandemic, and that was just such a scary time. It was such a scary time. Before the pandemic, there was around 38 million people in the United States who were suffering from food insecurity. During the height of the pandemic, about 54 million people began to suffer from food insecurity, many of whom who had never been financially insecure before. People in the middle class were losing their jobs, were burning through their savings, and became what we call food insecure, meaning they weren't consistently sure where their next meal was going to come from. After the pandemic became in a new place, it's still with us today. People are still suffering because of the coronavirus. But after the vaccine and things changed, the passage of time, today, about 44 million people in the United States are food insecure. So for us, the issue of not throwing away perfectly good food is one of the simplest ways to ensure that people who are suffering from food insecurity have the food that they deserve. I will also say, all throughout the time that we've been here at Food Recovery Network, people have cared about feeding their neighbors, and they've also cared about the environment, as has been so well highlighted through Colin and Eve's remarks. When we throw food away, as Colin mentioned, the number 1 place where that food goes is into landfill. So it is not made into energy, it's not anaerobically digested, it's not recovered, it's thrown away. And when it is thrown away, it mostly goes into landfill. That is the food system as it is right now. And as we know, when that food goes into landfill, it might not get hot enough, to turn into compost. It begins to rot and overproduce CO2 and other greenhouse gases. Food waste is the 3rd leading cause of global warming in the world. And the United States is the number 1 emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. Number 2 is China. And so for us at Food Recovery Network, what we are trying to do as the number 1 greenhouse gas emitter, can we tackle the number 3 emitter? And as Eve so wonderfully mentioned, in terms of consumer behaviors and hearing some of these statistics, I talk a lot about fight, flight, freeze, fawn. When we hear very overwhelming statistics, 44 million people, we were born into this. We were born into people being hungry. 44 million people. Global warming, storms are getting harder. Okay, how much more can the world, the degrees in temperature rise before it's calamitous? What is that number? How will we know when that number happens? What can I do? It can feel very overwhelming. It can make us want to freeze. And so I say a lot that the wonderful thing about food recovery is that we can all have a part to play in this. You know, Colin had mentioned at the consumer level, you know, that is where, or excuse me, at the farm level, that is where there is a lot of food that is wasted, and that is actually where Food Recovery Network sits. So we're at the farm fields, all the way up to the grocery stores, restaurants, higher education, corporate dining, large scale events, you name it. And Food Recovery Network is there to help support food recovery programs to be established. So we do that at the higher ed level. We want higher ed to be the first sector where food recovery is the norm and not the exception. And we also support these other areas outside of higher education, again, large scale events, convention centers, conferences, corporate dining that has, you know, food dining options. We also want to support these locations in being having a food recovery program. So I'm happy to talk to everybody about what it's like to do that. And I will leave with this. You know, Eve had mentioned about eaters and we're wasting food. Excuse me, wasting money when we waste food, and it's true. It's proven. Food Recovery Network, we're lending our voice to the Food Date Labeling Act, which is a way to end confusion on food date labeling. Because people in the United States are unnecessarily throwing food away because they are confused by the use by, best by, consume by, all the other different labels. And we can get into that too. But it's about between $1,500 and $2,500 annually that the average family is wasting because of this confusion. And we know that my last point with that is through our data-driven work, that of the 3,400 plus counties in the United States, only about 22 of them do people on average make a living wage. And I bring that up because most families, to some degree, are struggling financially in ways that we might not see it. We have this very narrow view of what it means to be poor, to be struggling in the United States. But on average, many, many families are struggling. And so the more food we can keep in our homes, the better for everybody. And that also allows more food products to be donated to food banks, homeless shelters, you name it. So look forward to talking with everyone further, even beyond today, about how we can all get together because there really are some very easy things we can all do. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks so much, Regina. So before I turn it over back to Michelle, because we are starting to get some questions in the chat, so I encourage everybody to put some questions forward quickly, Colin, so very quickly. I think that Regina and Eve really sort of contextualized what happens when the food, you know, kind of gets to the retail consumer level or to homes. But could you talk quickly about, because you made a statement in passing that a lot of the food waste happens before it gets to the customer. Could you just help us understand that very, very quickly, and then we're going to move to questions.
So this can happen for a number of reasons, but a lot of times, you know, growers will grow crops, but they may not have the labor to properly harvest it. They may find that their processor is, you know, kind of fully booked and there's no place to sell it to. They may find if there's a delay in shipment and a truck gets stuck somewhere, if you've got fresh food, you know, in a pre-processed form, it can't sit in a truck or in, you know, kind of a holding pile for very long before it starts to decompose to the point where it's no longer safe or doesn't meet standards to be consumed. So, you know, a lot of the food waste happens long before consumers see it, which is not to say that you know, consumer and post-consumer waste isn't meaningful. It absolutely is. We can absolutely do a lot to better use the food once it gets into our grocery stores through things like food recovery programs and just being more, you know, judicious about what we buy and trying to make sure that we throw out a lot. But in a lot of cases, it's, you know, either delays or bottlenecks upstream in the processing system, or in some cases, you know, what'll happen is farmers will decide what to plant, and then 6 months later turns out the price for that particular crop is just not enough to justify bringing in a crew to harvest it, process it, and get it to market, and then they just plow it back under, you know, and return the carbon to the soil. because they can't make any money, and it would put them at a loss to be getting it to market and getting it into a place where it can be consumed.
Okay, well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, and let's keep our discussion going, getting some input from all of you who've been listening.
Great. Thanks, Amy. And thank you all for your excellent points and presentations. Regina, I'll just say I worked for a very famous, popular global coffee chain when I was an undergrad, and it was so frustrating at the end of my shift to take the food that had not been sold and basically place it in trash bags at the end of the day. So really glad to hear about the great work that's happening here. So a question that came in from an audience member, and Eve, this question is for you, but feel free to chime in, Colin and Regina, as appropriate. You mentioned that the current narrative is one that is negative and loss-centered, and that people are making decisions based on short-term benefits rather than long-term sustainability. This person is curious, what are the short-term gains that can be pitched to change this narrative?
Great question. I'm going to give you, I can give you a couple examples. So we right now, Food for Climate League has what we call our Cool Beans Project. We are trying to change the way that young people think about beans, ultimately aiming to get young people to choose bean-based dishes instead of meat-based dishes. There's lots of reasons why we've aligned on beans, and if you're curious, I'm happy to go into that. But we've been doing narrative testing. And so what we're trying to do here is really follow the best practices of all food marketers and general lifestyle marketers, which is figure out what makes people tick. And we've done an enormous amount of consumer insights, eater insights. We've been focused mainly on foodie demographics and also low income. So we have found that low income and foodie, Gen Zers, millennials have the highest intention action gap when it comes to bean consumption. Really interesting to look at what the current narratives are around beans. I will tell you one of the most interesting insights is, beans are associated with poverty. When you think about it, you're like, oh, well, that makes sense. They're so ubiquitous that many people just don't think they're special. They're so easily accessible. And so we're working to counter that. Now, what narratives have risen to the top for us? Number one, protein. Focusing on the immediate protein benefits. If you look at any consumer insights, any reason why anyone's buying anything these days, there's even like protein-filled water that's being sold. Why not highlight the fact that beans are not just fulfilling your starch requirements, they're fulfilling your protein requirements. So this is a big area of kind of flipping the narrative. So you're not focused on, the ubiquity and the cost savings even, you're focused on protein. The other part that is resonating is this idea of celebrating your own culture. Most cultures around the world have beans. We found that especially amongst our African-American respondents, they are most interested, most excited about this angle of food justice, of beans being a symbol of food justice, of food access, food sovereignty. You can grow so many different kinds of beans. And it really is this idea of inclusive ways of eating. And so there's a lot of other, cultural trends around this that we can be building upon for young people. And how amazing would it be if we can focus on beans as that pillar of food access, food justice, and food equity? So that's just an example of the reframe, right? For many people, again, it's associated with poverty. But then you also, to ask people questions, they have these wonderful flavor memories and family moments that come to mind. And so it's about pulling that to the forefront. So that's the type of work that we do. There are so many gains. It really just depends, though, on your audience. And this is a big part of what we do at Food for Climate League, is saying there really usually is not one size fits all. In the same way that there is no one size fits all for any marketing campaign. You need to understand what this individual is laying awake at night worried about. You need to understand, what do they have access to? What is culturally relevant for them? And there are kind of some basic tenets of communications that speak to our core human needs that connect us all as human beings. We all want a sense of control and safety. We all want a sense of community and belonging. We all want a sense of purpose and meaning in our lives. If you're trying to create something super general, speak to those core human needs. But otherwise, it's really about finding what are those benefits for that individual or the person in that job.
Great. Thank you for that, Eve. Regina, Colin, anything that you'd like to add to that before we move on?
Yeah, one thought that occurs to me is, people today are feeling sort of stressed and overwhelmed, and it's because of a society that has really kind of pushed always be productive, always be working. And I think in a lot of cases, there's at least some evidence in behavioral studies literature that sitting down and having a meal and making it a time for personal time or connection with your community, whether it's family or found family or anybody, but using that as a way to sort of reclaim your identity and your time and have space to get out of everything that is challenging and leading to stress. And as you create this time, in a lot of cultures that ends up being centered around meals, certainly in a lot of European countries that report higher general satisfactions with life, mealtime is more of a social and family event. It's more of a kind of landmark in the day, not just a grab food and eat it quickly while you move from one thing to another. So reclaiming that time and reclaiming the role of food and family meals as an important part of how we create community helps with this, because I think it also starts getting people to think about the food choices more and to create space where they're not just trying to figure out, what's the quickest thing that I can DoorDash and eat on the couch or eat at my desk while I'm trying to do something else.
My only addition to that, it's such a wonderful unfolding question. I love these responses. Does get back to that economic security piece. I just shared an article about, FRN is a volunteer-driven nonprofit. So much with the nonprofit sector is volunteer-driven, and that is in no way going to consistently feed 44 million people. We need other policies. And one of the things that we need policies at the federal and state level. And one of the drivers that Food Recovery Network focuses on is, yes, feeding people today. People deserve food today. But we focus on economic security. And one of the things that we are fighting with the Poor People's Campaign is the increase of the federal minimum wage. Dr. King will remind us that it is a shame that in the United States, the wealthiest nation in the United States, that people are given poverty wages for their labor. And we can trace how that happened across the birth of capitalism, that we ask people to work and demand that people work for such low wages, they must work multiple jobs to make things work. And so that idea of having time to relax just isn't a possibility for people because of that mindset that Colin and Eve so wonderfully brought up and spoke on.
Great, thank you both for those extra comments. That's kind of a good lead into the next question that came into the chat, which Colin, this is for you, but again, everyone feel free to contribute. Government support for biofuels plummeted around 2008 when increased reliance on biofuels was perceived to be the cause of the rise in food prices internationally. This person is wondering where government support for biofuels stands today and how that influences its adoption.
So that is a fascinating question, a little bit difficult to try to give a short answer to. There have absolutely been sort of waves of support and interest in biofuels over the last 20 years or so. So the first wave happened really in Europe, where their transportation system uses a lot more diesel. They put incentives out saying, bring us biodiesel, really was the issue there. And because their incentives were rather poorly designed, they got a lot of palm oil biodiesel. The palm oil was generated by slashing and burning rainforests in Southeast Asia on high peat land. It was an utter environmental disaster, and they had to quickly sort of walk it back. And that kind of definitely soured a lot of opinion on biofuels, certainly in Europe, and led us to at least become aware of these indirect land use change impacts. In the US, really sort of around the time Europe was getting burned by its first, the biofuel impact, the George W. Bush administration passed what they called the Energy Independence and Security Act, which is what led to that 15 billion gallons a year of ethanol in the US. It was largely viewed as an energy security thing, trying to reduce dependence on foreign oil. Later, some environmental value was kind of tacked onto it. It doesn't provide a ton of environmental value, but there's a little bit there. The support for ethanol has been really stable since then. You know, the bill passed in 05 or 06. It grew the industry to where it is today, and it's been kind of, the ethanol industry has been there for more or less as it is today for a good 10 or 15 years now, and it's stable and is likely to continue that way. Right now, the issue is largely around sustainable aviation fuel, as well as to a lesser extent renewable diesel and biodiesel. The IRA, which passed in 2022, has got some additional tax credits for sustainable aviation fuel, which is largely going to be biofuels. There's a lot of discussion about what's the right way to assess the greenhouse gas implications. You know, the administration is trying to strike a balance where politically they want to help Midwest states that have a lot of growers of corn and soy, which could benefit from one of these programs, but also not alienate the environmental community. That's a big part of the Democratic coalition, who is somewhat skeptical about these. And so they're trying to find how much growth can we do there without going too far. That is still a very emerging process. We're still, you know, one of the programs, the IRA programs, finally released their guidance recently. It tends to be kind of in the middle, maybe a little bit favorable toward the biofuel producers, but one of the others is still under debate. So support has generally grown over the last few years. And the question is it going to continue growing very quickly, or is it going to continue growing slowly? And I think there is environmental value in continuing slow growth. I am concerned about rapid growth.
That's great. Thank you for that. In our remaining time, I guess what I will ask you is, we've talked a lot about what actions individuals can take. We've talked about some policy and some private sector actions as well. But as we sort of wrap up, maybe a question for each of you to consider is, what would you like to see in maybe the next 5 or 10 years? What action do you want government to take, private sector to take, and what do you suggest for attendees here who want to make a positive change here? What can they do this week or next week to start moving this in the right direction? So I don't know who wants to take that
Lightning
very
round.
easy answer question first. Amy, go for it.
Oh, I'm not going for it. I'm not. I'd let the experts do. We have, say, 2 minutes each.
Great. I don't mind going first real quick. So wonderful question, Michelle. Thank you. And so I would say, first of all, you know, at FRN, direct appeal, you know, if people have a connection to a higher ed campus, we would love to see more Food Recovery Network chapters. That is definitely something that you can do today. Even I don't think I can, but let me introduce you to, you know, volunteer other people. That would be really wonderful. And in the next, you know, few years, as we work to move from food waste being the norm to food recovery, you know, as I mentioned, the Food Date Labeling Act, this is something that we can talk to our House of Representatives about to co-sponsor this bill. It will save billions of dollars annually every year for consumers. It will ensure, as I said, millions of pounds of food that is now being sent to landfill that is still perfectly good to eat, that can be donated and distributed across the United States. So the Food Date Labeling Act is huge. And if you've never been in touch with your elected officials, this is a really easy one. It has bipartisan support already. You don't need to be an expert in it. You can just say, hey, this is going to save everyone a lot of money. It's going to save a lot of food. That's about as much as you need to know. And it's just a nice way that we should be in touch with our elected officials about this. And so those are some of the things that I think, you know, we would like to see, you know, moving forward, that we don't want it to be so easy to devalue the beautiful food that all of our farmers are making, our farmhands are harvesting, you know, truck drivers are transporting. We don't want to make it so easy to just toss that food away. This food has value and it can really help save lives.
I can go ahead, Eve.
Colin, go ahead, Colin.
Okay. I would say the biggest impact thing people can do right now, at least as I see it, is get politically engaged. And this feels weird coming at this as a scientist who, you know, wants to use science as a way to make the world better. But I'm a scientist who you know, has been in the policy process and worked for advocacy groups. In the US, there is one party that believes that protecting the environment is important and has generally, at least moved in the right direction, perhaps not always exactly right or as fast as we want, but at least move in the right direction. There's one party that actively opposes it and makes opposing environmental protection part of their core identity. Yeah, if you look at all the states that have better climate outcomes, better environmental justice outcomes, better air quality outcomes, they're all governed by one of these two parties. So if you really want to sort of help climate change, and that has really been what I've dedicated most of my life to fighting right now, it's get politically engaged and make sure that the party that actually wants to do anything about this is the one that has as much of a voice in government as possible.
And then Eve, let me just ask you quickly before we say goodbye. I know you've posted some things about what we can do as influencers, but what about government? Is there anything you think government should be doing in terms of sort of moving us to a more plant-forward diet?
I am not a policy expert, but there are 1,000 things that the government could be doing to move us to a more plant-forward diet. But I actually think that the action is incumbent upon each and every one of us. How do we soften the ground so that politicians are less afraid to enter this space? Diet change is one of the most, if not the most effective way to combat the climate crisis. Yet what politician feels safe going out there today to talk about diet change? Practically nobody. And a really great kind of case study for this is the gay rights movement, where the public shifted before the policy shifted. And I think in many ways, we need to create a world in which plant-forward, zero-waste ways of eating and conducting business become the norm, so that there are more politicians who feel it's politically safe to come into this space. And we need to be giving them the narrative and the framing that makes sense for their own constituents, because this does meet people's core needs, whether you are within a conservative environment or a liberal environment. And so I'd say every day, if you can even talk to friends and family or post about your plant forward meal or the way that you are utilizing every single thing in your pantry, that is going to make impact, because you're also cueing to other people what you think of as the norm and what is acceptable. And it's over time we're going to make that change. So I'm not going to go into individual policies, but I think the more and more we can soften the ground for politicians to make the necessary changes is going to make a big impact.
Love that point. That's absolutely been my experience. Back when we had trouble getting people to buy cars that were more fuel efficient, I actually created a campaign together with the AAA Auto Club. And it was a national campaign. I went to the different chapters in different parts of the country, and we did wind up with a new bill in 2007. So we can do that in a food forward way and get the focus on that. So I really appreciate those remarks. Well, I just want to thank everybody on our panelists everybody for coming, our panelists for their excellent contributions. Michelle, you want to give us a last minute on, can you want to send the rewatch to friends and family? Where do they go?
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Amy, as well. Thanks to everyone who came. We have recorded today's conversation, so we will hopefully be posting that on our YouTube page very soon. We'll send a follow-up email to everybody who registered. I've saved the chat and all of the amazing resources that have been shared throughout the conversation, so I'll make sure to include that as well. And stay tuned. We will hopefully, along with the Mayor's Office of Food Policy, the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, and the NYU Office of Sustainability, offer an additional conversation on these topics in the fall, focusing on solutions, both on an individual and a systems basis. So keep an eye out for those conversations. We hope to bring back some of our fantastic speakers to help participate in those. And yeah, thank you again for joining us on this Wednesday, and we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day.
And let me just add one more thing, really exciting, and thank you especially to Michael Shank and to Niti Jain for co-organizing with us, and Cecil Schwab from our Sustainability Office here at NYU. And the Energy, Climate Justice, and Sustainability Lab is going to energize its Instagram feed starting June 1. We'll hopefully distribute some of this content. A lot of the things that were posted in the chat, you're going to be able to find on our Instagram. And so we're, following Eve and Regina in the sort of social media ways of knowing that we need to get out there, man on the street, with our Instagram. So we will be back in touch with all of you, so you know to follow us and send us contributions.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much. Have a
Thanks.
good day.